In 1976, a watch factory in Schaffhausen released a steel sports watch drawn by the most celebrated designer in the industry. Between 1976 and 1983, they sold 598 of them. That was the entire production run, not the annual figure. The company itself now calls it the most brilliant failure in its history. Everybody knows the Royal Oak. Everybody knows the Nautilus. But those two watches did not build this category by themselves. 7 brands did. And you have probably never heard of half of them. Coming in at number 7, and I want to be clear that number 7 here is still an extraordinary piece of design, we have IWC Schaffhausen and the Ingenieur SL, reference 1832. Gerald Genta drew it in 1974. IWC released it in 1976 in the middle of the quartz crisis, with a cushion case, a bezel cut with 5 asymmetrical notches, and an integrated bracelet that made the whole watch look like it had been machined out of a single block. Inside was the in-house caliber 8541 with Peloton winding and a soft iron cage protecting the movement against magnetism up to roughly 1,000 Gauss. On paper, it should have sold. Here's where it falls apart. Audemars Piguet sold the Royal Oak as luxury. Patek Philippe sold the Nautilus as luxury. IWC, being a tool watch company down to its bones, sold the Ingenieur to engineers. Actual engineers. And the engineers looked at Genta's design and said, no thank you. Sales meetings got canceled. Dealers called it too avant-garde. 598 pieces went out the door over 7 years, and the line was killed in 1983. 4 decades later, IWC made a short film about it and called it their most brilliant failure. I love that. That is a company that finally understood what it had been holding. Number 6 is one I would bet most people have never seriously considered, and that is Girard-Perregaux with the Laureato. In 1975, while everyone else in this category was hiring outside designers, Girard-Perregaux did the entire thing in-house. The case, the bracelet, the dial, and the movement. 3 geometries stacked on top of each other. An octagonal bezel sitting on a round base, sitting on a tonneau case. And then there is the part everyone forgets. The first Laureato was not mechanical. It was quartz. Girard-Perregaux had built its own electronics research department back in 1966 and developed a quartz caliber running at 32,768 Hz. That frequency is now the universal standard for every quartz watch on Earth, yours included, most likely. The first Laureato was also certified as a chronometer, which for a quartz watch in 1975 was a genuine flex. It did not even carry the name at first. It was sold as the quartz chronometer, and it was Italian collectors who started calling it Il Laureato, the graduate, because it arrived with its certification like a diploma. Girard-Perregaux did not make that name official until 1995. 20 years of a nickname doing the marketing for them. That is the most undervalued story in this entire category. At number 5 is Chopard, and this is my favorite origin story on the list. In 1980, Chopard was a gold and diamond house. They had never made a steel watch. They had never made a sports watch. And a 22-year-old employee named Carl Friedrich Schofle, whose family owned the company, went to his father and asked to build one anyway. His father was not enthusiastic. He said yes, regardless, mostly out of respect for his son's conviction. 18 months later, they had the St. Moritz, designed, prototyped, and produced entirely in-house, with a curving bezel and exposed screws that looked like nothing else in the category. When dealers in Hong Kong doubted the water resistance, Schofle reportedly pulled the watch off his own wrist and dropped it into a champagne bucket. By the first day of the 1980 Basel Fair, he had 1,000 orders. For comparison, the initial run of the Royal Oak was also 1,000 pieces, and it took considerably longer to move them. The St. Moritz became one of Chopard's best sellers for the following decade, and in 2019, the company brought the whole idea back as the Alpine Eagle. Same family, next generation, and the same argument with his father, only in reverse. Number 4 is where somebody deliberately zigged. In 1979, the rule in this category was steel. Steel was the entire point. Steel priced like gold was the joke that Audemars Piguet had turned into an industry, and Yves Piaget looked at all of that and built his sports watch out of solid 18-karat gold. The Piaget Polo weighed around 130 grams. It had no numerals and no minute track, just alternating polished and satin gadroons running across the dial and straight out into the bracelet without a break anywhere on the watch. Piaget's own line about it was that this was a bracelet watch, not a watch with a bracelet. It had no name at first either, only a reference number, and Piaget christened it the Polo purely for marketing, because his customers were the polo crowd, and he loved the sport enough to ride his own team down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan to launch it. That is how you introduce a watch. It debuted at the Palm Beach Polo World Cup on the wrist of Ursula Andress. Piaget brought the original design back in 2024 as the Polo 79 in gold, with an ultra-thin automatic movement in place of the old quartz caliber. It looks almost exactly like 1979, and that is precisely the point. 3 brands left, and this is where the stories stop being about watches and start being about people who got told no. Every brand from here down was written off by somebody who should have known better. Number 3 is Gerald Charles, and if that name means nothing to you, you already understand the problem. Gerald Charles Genta drew the Royal Oak. He drew the Nautilus. He drew the Ingenieur. In 2000, he sold the company carrying his surname to Bulgari for $23 million. And then, at an age when most people retire to a boat, he started over with a new house built from his first 2 names. 3 years later, he handed the business to the Ziviani family, Italians he had known for years, and stayed on as chief designer until his death in 2011. The signature piece is the Maestro. It is an asymmetric case, flat across the top, curved and creased along the bottom, and on paper it should not work at all. It works beautifully. The brand today makes fewer than 1,200 watches a year, and every one of them originates from a Genta drawing made between 2000 and 2011. So the man who invented this entire category has a house carrying his own name, still building his own designs, and most of the people wearing a Royal Oak have never heard of it. That is the strangest fact in modern watchmaking. Number 2 is Zapek, and this one reaches back further than anything else here. Francois Zapek was Antoine Patek's original business partner. When that partnership dissolved, Patek found a new partner named Adrien Philippe, and you already know how that turned out. Zapek founded his own house in 1845, sold to the Circle around Napoleon III, opened a boutique on the Place Vendôme in 1850, and then the name went quiet for roughly a century. It sat dead. In 2012, a small group of enthusiasts legally resurrected it, and in 2015 they funded the relaunch through equity crowdfunding, which made Zapek the first high horology house brought back to life by collectors themselves. Then in May of 2020, in the middle of a global lockdown, with every boutique on Earth shuttered, they launched an integrated bracelet sports watch called the Antarctique. It should have been catastrophic timing. The first limited editions sold out within weeks. By the end of 2022, the backlog had passed 2,000 watches, and Zapek had to close the order books entirely. This spring, they showed the Antarctique in titanium with a dial they call Cosmic Blue, including a tourbillon limited to 25 pieces. That is not bad for a name that spent 100 years in the ground. And in the number 1 spot, Vacheron Constantin and the 222. In 1977, Vacheron was the oldest continuously operating watch manufacturer in the world, and it was turning 222 years old. They had already attempted a sports watch, the Chronomaster Royal of 1975, and it failed so completely they pulled it within 2 years. So for the anniversary piece, they did not call Genta. They called a German designer in his early 20s named Jorg Heisek, who had spent time at Rolex and had barely opened his own studio. Vacheron was one of his very first clients. What he handed them was a monoblock case, 37 millimeters across and 7 millimeters thick, with a fluted bezel, hexagonal center links tapering down into the wrist, and the Maltese cross applied to the case at 5 o'clock. To my eye, it is the most elegant watch in this entire category, and it was drawn by somebody nobody had heard of. Roughly 800 of the 37mm jumbos were built between 1977 and 1984. Compare that to more than 4,000 steel Royal Oaks in the first reference alone, and around 7,200 Nautilus jumbos. Rarity like that does not get manufactured. It only happens by accident. Vacheron discontinued the 222 in the 80s, and it very nearly vanished. They brought it back in gold in 2022 and in steel in January of 2025, and it immediately became one of the most wanted watches of the year. Half a century late, but it arrived. So here is the part where I am supposed to tell you this category is finished. You have heard it. Everybody has an integrated bracelet now, at every brand, at every price point. The comment section under every new release says the same thing, that the genre is saturated and it all looks identical. I understand the fatigue. I really do. It is a fair complaint, and it is also very close to the complaint people made about the Royal Oak in 1972. But I would ask you to look at what that saturation actually produced. Competition is why the bracelets got more comfortable. Competition is why case thicknesses came down. Competition is why a house that had been dead for a century could come back and outdesign companies 10 times its size. The market has not agreed with the funeral either. After 3 hard years of correction, the main pre-owned index tracking 300 watches across the 10 largest luxury brands rose more than 8% in the 12 months to February of this year, and the recovery kept broadening through June. Tech Philippe alone is up more than 19% year over year. Rolex, of all companies, finally built an integrated bracelet watch. At the Geneva Fair this spring, this category did not shrink. It filled the halls. But I do not think the real lesson here is about prices. The real lesson is those 598 watches from Schaffhausen. Every single brand on this list got told no. Genta got told his design was too strange for the customer. A 22-year-old got told to sit down. Vacheron got told their first attempt was a flop. Zapek got told the name was dead and buried. And not one of those people was actually wrong at the time. They were just early. In this hobby, being early and being wrong look exactly the same. Right up until the morning, they do not. If